Ambassador Kane ripped out the alien's throat with his teeth. Hot, viscous blood coated his tongue, bitter, metallic wrong. The Zinder soldier gave a strangled gurgle, clawing at the gaping wound in his neck as he crumpled to the cold steel floor, his body twitching before going still. Kane spat, wiping his mouth with the back of his trembling hand, the taste of death still thick on his lips. His other hand clutched a jagged wound in his side, warmth spilling between his fingers. The air reeked of scorched flesh and ozone, the acrid stench of plasma, burns mingling with the raw, iron tang of blood. A dozen corpses lay around him, some human, most alien. Flickering emergency lights bathed the carnage in red. The room had been pristine hours ago, a polished chamber aboard the Zinder diplomatic vessel where negotiations had taken place. Now, it was a slaughterhouse. Kane's breath rasped in his throat. His finely tailored suit was in shreds, dark with gore. His left arm hung useless at his side, half severed by a blade that had come far too close to ending him. His ribs ached with every breath. He had been beaten, stabbed, burned, and he was still standing. This was supposed to be a diplomatic mission. The Zinder had invited humanity to discuss terms, to negotiate a path toward cooperation. They had smiled with sharp teeth, their elongated skulls nodding with apparent understanding. And then, the doors had sealed. The first blade had found its way into Ambassador Rourke's chest before anyone could react. Plasma fire filled the air. Screams. Chaos. Kane had hit the floor as the slaughter began, the Zinder reveling in the butchery. They had underestimated him. One of the soldiers, a massive brute nearly 8 feet tall, had grabbed Kane by the throat, lifting him effortlessly from the ground, ready to gut him like an animal. Desperation had driven him to do the unthinkable. He had wrenched himself forward, clamping his teeth around the creature's exposed neck, and ripped. Now, that same brute lay lifeless at his feet. Kane spat again, the taste still lingering. His pulse hammered in his ears. His team was dead. Men and women he had known for years. Diplomats who had truly believed in peace. Their bodies lay broken around him, torn apart in a show of dominance. The Zinder had intended to send a message, but they had no idea what kind of message they had just sent. The Zinder Dominion was one of the oldest and most feared empires in the Orion Spur. They had conquered world after world with brute force, subjugating the weak, annihilating the defiant. To them, humanity was nothing more than another fledgling species playing a diplomacy, too naive to understand that only strength mattered in the end. They weren't entirely wrong. Kane had spent the last 15 years pretending. A diplomat, a negotiator, a bridge between humanity and the wider galaxy. But that had never been who he truly was. He had been something else before. A soldier, a hunter, a weapon. He had buried that part of himself beneath layers of civility, but the Zinder had dug it up with their own hands. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the corridor beyond, low and wet with hunger. Kane's head snapped toward the sound. More were coming. They would have heard the fighting, smelled the blood. He staggered forward, pressing a hand to his wound, forcing himself through the haze of pain. His foot slipped in something wet. He didn't look down. He couldn't. The ship's control panel was across the room, still flickering from the firefight. He reached it with agonizing slowness, bracing against the console for support. His fingers danced over the controls, keying in the override commands he had memorized earlier, because humans planned for betrayal. The ship's internal schematics flickered into view. Security systems, life support, communications. He locked the doors, shut down the ventilation in sections where Zinder troops were likely to be, activated an emergency distress beacon. Not for rescue. No, there was no saving this mission. This was a war declaration. Kane keyed in a message, his voice hoarse but steady. This is Ambassador Kane. The Zinder have broken the treaty. The delegation is dead. Humanity is at war. He transmitted it directly to the horizon, The human flagship stationed at the edge of Zinder space, its weapons systems primed, but dormant. They had come under the guise of neutrality, a mere escort for the diplomats. Now, they would burn a path through this sector. The growling outside grew louder. The Zinder were hunters by nature. They would not run from him. Not yet. They would come for him slowly, savoring his suffering. They thought he was just a wounded animal, limping and cornered. They didn't understand what a cornered human was capable of. Kane inhaled sharply, straightening. The pain was unbearable, but he pushed it aside. He reached down, prying a plasma blade from a fallen Zinder's grip. It hummed to life in his hand, the violet energy crackling along its edge. Footsteps pounded toward the door, claws clicking against metal. He could almost see them in his mind, tall, armored figures moving with predatory grace, eyes burning with anticipation. They would open that door thinking they were finishing a massacre. They had no idea they were about to become part of it. Kane flexed his grip on the blade, rolling his shoulders despite the agony lancing through his body. Blood dripped steadily from his wounds, pooling at his feet. His heartbeat slowed, his breathing evened. A familiar calm settled over him. The old instincts stirred, rising from the depths where he had buried them. The door slid open. Kane moved. The first Zinder through the door died before he could react. Kane twisted aside, his plasma blade carving a violet arc through the air, shearing through armor and flesh like wet parchment. The alien barely had time to gurgle before his head tumbled free of his shoulders, body collapsing in a boneless heap. The others hesitated. It lasted less than a second, but it was there, that brief flicker of doubt, the primal recognition that something was wrong. They had stormed into this room expecting a wounded, dying diplomat. Instead, they had found something else, something that didn't retreat, didn't plead, didn't fear. Kane surged forward. The next soldier raised his rifle. Too slow. Kane lunged, twisting the weapon aside as he drove his knee into the alien's midsection. Bone crunched. The Zinder staggered, wheezing. Kane followed up with a brutal slash across the throat, severing arteries and vocal cords in one motion. The third managed to fire. Pain exploded across Kane's ribs, a searing heat as the plasma round punched through flesh. He bit back the scream, riding the agony, letting it sharpen him instead of slow him. He moved through the pain, through the haze, twisting to bring his blade up and into the shooter's gut. The alien convulsed, choking, tried to push him away. Kane grabbed the back of its head and wrenched sideways. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber. The body slumped to the floor. And then, silence. He stood amidst the bodies, chest heaving, blood pooling at his feet. The wound in his side burned like fire, but he remained upright. He had fought through worse. The Zinder had fallen in seconds, and yet he knew more were coming. They always came in packs. Kane wiped a trembling hand across his mouth, smearing blood across his face. The old instincts had fully awoken now, thrumming in his veins like a long-forgotten song. He had spent years pretending to be something he wasn't. A diplomat, a civilized man. No more. He turned back to the control panel, fingers dancing across the flickering interface. The security schematics updated in real time. Zinder forces were moving through the ship, closing in. They had locked down the docking bays, preventing any escape. Not that it mattered. Kane hadn't planned on leaving. He opened the ship-wide comms. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I know you can hear me." A pause. The system crackled. He imagined Zinder officers scrambling at their consoles, listening to the voice of a man they had tried to kill. "You thought this would be easy. You thought you'd cornered a wounded animal." Kane picked up one of the fallen rifles, checking its charge. "You were wrong." He killed the transmission. The Zinder command deck was already in chaos. High Warlord Var loomed over the hollow display, watching in cold disbelief as the status feeds flickered red, one after another. His elite warriors dead. The human diplomat, alive. This was impossible. Humans were supposed to be weak. Talkers. Diplomats. The kind of species that knelt when faced with real power. The Zinder had fought dozens of wars, crushed countless civilizations. None had ever resisted like this. Var turned toward his second-in-command, voice a low growl. Kill him. The officer hesitated. We've already sent 2 strike teams. Send more. The officer hesitated a second too long. Var's claws lashed out, ripping across the alien's throat in one clean motion. The body crumpled, twitching. Var turned to the others. No one else dared to speak. Burn him out, the warlord ordered. Seal the corridors. Flood the ventilation with fire if you have to. No more mistakes. Kane was already moving. He had memorized the ship's layout from the moment he'd stepped aboard, an old habit from his previous life. He knew where they would try to corner him. He knew where he needed to be. The armory. If he was going to end this, he needed better firepower. He kept moving, keeping his steps quiet, his breathing even. He could feel the weight of his wounds now. Burns, lacerations, broken ribs. But pain was nothing new. Pain was fuel. A sudden hiss filled the air. The ventilation system roared to life, spewing thick smoke and heat. The Zender were trying to cook him out. Clever. Kane pulled a dead soldier's rebreather free and strapped it over his face, pushing forward through the haze. He could hear movement ahead, heavy boots pounding against the deck, guttural voices barking orders. They were setting up an ambush. He let them. They thought he was blindly running. They didn't realize he had already counted them. 6 bodies, standard formation. 2 on the left, 2 on the right, 2 in the center with heavy weapons. Predictable. He fired first. The rifle's plasma bolt took the nearest Zender through the skull, dropping him instantly. The others reacted with a flurry of gunfire, plasma bolts screaming past him as he dove for cover. Heat singed the edges of his torn suit. He rolled, came up firing. Another fell. The remaining 4 closed in, switching to melee. They thought they had him. Kane let them get close. The first swung, a wide, clumsy strike. Kane ducked low, drove a blade up into the alien's ribcage, twisted. He felt the body jerk, then go still. The next Zender came from the right, faster, more precise. Kane barely managed to deflect the strike before slamming his rifle, but into the alien's jaw. He was fast, but not invincible. The third caught him with a glancing blow, claws raking across his shoulder. Pain exploded through his arm. He turned the momentum, pulling the attacker forward and into his blade. A spray of hot blood washed over him. The last Zender tried to flee. Kane shot him in the back. He staggered, breath ragged, body screaming for rest. But he wasn't finished yet. The armory door loomed ahead. He keyed in the override, stepping inside as the heavy door sealed behind him. Rows of weapons lined the walls, plasma rifles, explosives, combat knives. A soldier's paradise. Kane reached for the largest rifle he could find, checking its charge. Fully loaded. He turned to the ship's internal comms, pressing a single button. His voice, cold and steady, echoed through every corridor. I'm coming for you, Var. The ship trembled with the force of distant explosions. Kane didn't flinch. The Zender had finally stopped playing games. They had sealed off sections of the vessel, vented corridors into space, and sent everything they had after him. It wasn't enough. He adjusted his grip on the plasma rifle, the weight familiar, reassuring. The weapon hummed in his hands, fully charged. His borrowed armor, taken from a dead Zender officer, was a tight fit, but it would serve. Blood still oozed from his wounds, but he ignored it. He had no time for pain. The warlord was waiting. Kane moved quickly through the winding corridors, his steps silent, his senses razor-sharp. Every shadow could hide an ambush. Every doorway could be death. He had learned long ago how to feel the tension in the air, how to listen beyond the noise of battle. The Zender had never fought a human like him before. A patrol came into view up ahead. 4 soldiers, tense, weapons raised. Kane didn't hesitate. He brought up the rifle and fired a burst, the first plasma bolt taking the lead soldier in the throat, the next 2 finding the chest of the one behind him. The other 2 reacted, ducking into cover, barking orders in their guttural language. Kane sprinted forward, moving before they could recover. He slid across the blood-slick floor, coming up on one knee, firing under their cover. A scream, the scent of burning flesh. The last one lunged at him. A mistake. Kane caught the alien's wrist, twisting savagely. Bones snapped. The soldier howled in agony, dropping his weapon. Kane yanked him forward and drove his combat knife into the soft space beneath his jaw, shoving it up into the brain. The body spasmed, then went limp. He let it fall, wiping the blood from his blade with slow precision. The command deck was close now. High Warlord Var stood at the center of the Zender battlecruiser's nerve center, his claws digging into the armrests of his command throne. His yellow eyes burned as he listened to the reports. His elite warriors slaughtered. His defenses breached. His ship compromised. One human had done this. A diplomat. No, Var realized. Not a diplomat. A predator. The ship's main security feeds flickered, showing glimpses of the carnage. The once sterile corridors were soaked in blood. His warriors, the best of his kind, lay in broken heaps. The human moved through the wreckage with relentless purpose. His suit, torn and stained, no longer resembled anything a diplomat should wear. He looked like something pulled from an ancient nightmare. Var had fought countless wars. He had crushed species beneath his heel, burned worlds until their atmospheres boiled away. But as he watched the human advance, he felt something he had not felt in centuries. Doubt. Kane reached the final set of blast doors. Locked. Reinforced. He had expected this. The Zender were buying time, hoping to delay him long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It wouldn't matter. He pulled a pair of charges from his belt, affixing them to the thick metal. Stepping back, he keyed the detonator. The explosion ripped through the air, molten slag spraying outward. The doors groaned, then collapsed inward. He stepped through the smoke, weapon raised. The command deck was vast, lined with control stations and hollow displays. At the far end, Var rose from his throne, towering over his subordinates. He did not speak. There was no need for words. The warlord drew his blade, a massive thing, forged from a metal that shimmered with a dark, sickly sheen. A weapon that had taken countless lives. Kane dropped his rifle. This wasn't a fight for guns. The Zender watched in silence as he reached over his shoulder, pulling free a long combat knife. It was smaller, less imposing, but it wasn't the weapon that mattered. It was the man wielding it. Var moved first, fast despite his size. He came down in a vicious arc, his blade singing through the air. Kane sidestepped, pivoting on his heel, bringing his knife up in a flash of silver. Sparks flew as steel met steel. The force of the blow sent a jolt through Kane's arms, but he absorbed it, redirecting the momentum. He struck low, aiming for the warlord's ribs, but Var twisted away, lashing out with a brutal backhand. The blow caught Kane across the face, sending him stumbling. Blood filled his mouth. He spat, grinned. Var snarled, lunging again. The massive blade slashed forward, meant to cleave Kane in half. But Kane was already moving. He dropped low, rolling beneath the strike, coming up behind the warlord. His knife lashed out, once, twice. The first strike bit deep into Var's thigh. The second opened a gash along his side. The warlord bellowed in rage, swinging wildly. Kane ducked, feeling the blade whistle past his ear. The warlord was stronger, bigger, but Kane was faster. The fight blurred into instinct, strike, evade, counter. Kane danced around the warlord's attacks, landing precise, surgical blows. Var grew slower, his movements less refined. He was used to overwhelming opponents with raw power. He had never fought a human like this. And then Kane saw his opening. Var lunged. Kane pivoted, stepping into the attack. He caught the warlord's arm, twisting. The massive blade clattered to the floor. Kane didn't hesitate. He drove his knife upward, beneath the warlord's chin, burying it to the hilt. Var jerked, his eyes wide, his mouth opening in a silent gasp. Kane twisted the blade. The warlord shuddered. Then, slowly, he sank to his knees. His body swayed, then collapsed. Silence. The Zender officers stared in mute horror. Their warlord dead. The unstoppable force of their empire, fallen. Kane stepped over the corpse, retrieving his rifle. He turned toward the stunned officers, his voice calm. "This ship belongs to me now." No one moved. The command deck, once alive with the hum of strategy and war, now sat in frozen silence. The body of High Warlord Var lay in a dark pool of its own blood, his lifeless eyes staring toward the ceiling. Around him, Zender officers stood rigid, caught between instinct and terror. Their leader, their conqueror, had fallen. Kane wiped his blade clean against Var's cloak and sheathed it with slow, deliberate care. His every movement was measured, controlled. The predator had finished his kill, and now he surveyed the remains. He let the silence stretch, watching as the officers fidgeted, glancing between each other, waiting for someone, anyone, to act first. No one dared. Kane took a slow step forward. The officers flinched. These creatures, once so proud, so certain of their dominion over lesser beings, now resembled prey more than warriors. "Who's in command now?" His voice cut through the stillness like a blade. A younger officer, barely out of his initiation rites, if Kane had to guess, stepped forward, his throat bobbing. His uniform was pristine, untouched by war. Unlike Var, he had never fought for his power. Kane could smell the fear on him. I am Senior Tactician Voksh." The officer's voice wavered. I will assume control of the fleet until—" Kane shot him in the head. The plasma round punched through the alien's skull, the force of the impact sending his body crumpling backward. The officers gasped, some taking reflexive steps away. Kane lowered the rifle, tilting his head. "No," he said, "that's not how this works." He let the words sink in. Let them understand. The Zender Empire had ruled for centuries through brutality, through absolute, unyielding dominance. They had never negotiated from weakness. They had never met an enemy they couldn't crush beneath their boots. Until now. The officers stiffened, their gazes darting to the view screens, to the silent alarms flashing red across the consoles. They knew what was coming. Even now, Zender warships were moving into position, preparing to reclaim this vessel. Their warriors would not accept Var's death lightly. Neither would Kane. He turned toward the main display, fingers dancing over the controls. The warship's systems groaned in protest as he overrode security measures, rerouting command authority. A map of the Obsidian Fong, the Empire's most feared battlecruiser, flickered to life. Dozens of red markers swarmed across its structure. Zender strike teams, boarding pods, fighters scrambling for position. Kane studied it all with a cold, detached eye. Then, he took the ship offline. The lights flickered. Control panels went dark. A ripple of confusion swept through the officers as gravity faltered for a brief second before stabilizing. The Obsidian Fong was dead in space, its defenses severed, its systems locked under Kane's control. "W, what are you doing?" One of the officers finally broke, his voice tinged with barely contained panic. Kane didn't answer. Instead, he accessed the ship's weapon systems. The main cannons hummed to life, energy charging through their cores. The officers paled as the targeting display illuminated the Zender fleet beyond. Warships, cruisers, carriers, the heart of the Empire's military might, all gathered in formation, expecting a surrender, a desperate final stand. Kane had a different plan. He initiated the Fong's self-destruct sequence. The officers recoiled. No, you can't." Kane raised his rifle, silencing the nearest protester with a single shot. "Enough." His voice was quiet, but it held the weight of something far more terrifying than anger. It was final. The countdown began. The ship's core, overloaded with energy, would reach critical mass in less than 5 minutes. The explosion wouldn't just destroy the Obsidian Fong. It would take half the Zender fleet with it. The officers panicked. Some ran. Some scrambled for consoles, desperately trying to override his command. But it was too late. Kane had made sure of that. A few turned their weapons on him, rage flickering through their terror. A last, futile attempt at defiance. Kane dropped them before they could fire. One by one, the officers fell. When the final shot echoed into silence, Kane exhaled slowly. He stood alone now, surrounded by the dead. The battle was over. The war, perhaps, was just beginning. He tapped his wrist console, activating the emergency beacon. The signal pulsed through the void, a single message transmitting across every open channel. The warlord is dead. The empire burns. The Zender fleet was already shifting, their movements frantic. They hadn't expected this. Their most powerful ship, their strongest warriors, gone. Their warlord, their symbol of strength, fell by a single human. Kane made his way to the docking bay. The fires of the ship's imminent destruction cast flickering shadows against the walls. He could feel the tremors beneath his feet, the distant howls of the dying vessel. Every step forward was a step in a legend. The escape pod bay loomed ahead. He keyed in the launch sequence, stepping into the pod as the doors sealed behind him. The system ran a final check. Coordinates locked. Trajectory set. Kane didn't look back as he was ejected into the void. The obsidian fong erupted behind him, a supernova of fire and metal. The shock wave slammed into the surrounding fleet, ripping through their formations, sending debris and shattered hulls spiraling into the abyss. The Zender Empire would never recover from this. Kane drifted in the silence, watching the ruin unfold. They had called humanity weak. They had called them diplomats. But now the galaxy would understand. Humans were never meant to kneel. They were meant to hunt.